Welcome to Practical Shamanism. I'm Katie Weatherup. I'm a former engineer with 20 years of experience working as a shamanic practitioner, and I hope to help you to connect to your personal power and magic, and to support you in living a really good life that just keeps getting better. Thank you so much for joining me. One of the modalities of healing and looking at the world that I found incredibly useful was Byron Katie's work. So I spent a couple of years working with someone who was a facilitator, and as someone prone to black and white thinking with a very strong, definitive mind, I think I needed more of this medicine than most, because I tended to go to right and wrong and argue with people and prove my point and be rather rigid. And as you can imagine, these are not particularly helpful qualities in doing the kind of work I do. So there's a standing in my clarity that's useful, but also being able to have a healthy sense of, I don't know what's the right thing for a given person. I think that this would save them some grief. Their guides are recommending it, but if it's complicated and they're not ready to walk away from this romantic relationship or the dependency on a certain substance or whatever it is that's moving through their world that they're wanting to shift but not quite ready to do so on whatever level, it's really valuable to be able to hold space for that and to find within myself where I had the idea that I was going to make a change and then didn't, as I think we all tend to do. And one of the ways that you can apply this work, and if you want to go deeper, I believe her website is thework.com. You can get the formal and official training that shows you how to do this that I won't misrepresent by trying to make it more concise. She's put a lot more thought into conveying how to actually work with this. But what I want to talk about is a way to apply this to the world as a whole. If you're someone who really has a compassionate spirit. So a lot of the people I work with, and certainly what's true of my own life, is there's a part of myself that's having a personal experience, that's trying to figure out how not to make myself crazy with lack of closure when that's the case, or all the quirks and all the things that I'm working on about intimacy and connection and sexuality and emotional intelligence, and how, gosh darn it, not to try to shut down my emotions because no good ever comes of it. So I have all the personal things that are my quirks and blind spots and things I'm working with, and the experiences that I'm having in the world, the people that I spend time with, the walks that I take in the woods. There's a whole aspect of my life that's really about my own experience. And then there's also a transpersonal part where my soul is interested in being here as part of a larger picture, in what can I offer in service to the world through my participation. And there are a lot of answers I've come up with. This podcast is one of the attempts to meet that need and drive and desire in a way that is really aligned for me, that I really enjoy. And for a lot of us, there's an aliveness. And one of the challenges of being an individual human with access to a much larger scope of information in a planet with a population that is inconceivably large and a deep sense of empathy is, how do we balance our compassionate nature for humanity and the animals and the trees and the impact on the environment and the social systems that lack justice and all of these things that we are moved by as a decent person. I think there's just a basic level of, I don't want to say decency, I'm going to change my wording on that, and I'm going to change it to health. I would say that anyone who hears about racial injustice and doesn't care because it doesn't affect them may not be as healthy or evolved as they could be for kind of, nice basic functioning person. If we have a lot of tribal mentality that's us versus them, So there's a certain amount where I think there's just a basic level that a healthy person will be moved by the suffering of others. And then I think on top of that, there are people like me who just have a really high level of empathy, have a tremendous impact. I remember being so devastated as a child when there were a couple of neighbor girls who were just absolutely my idols. I was 5 or 6 and they let me follow them around, and they were 10 and 12. So older girls paying attention to me. It was just amazing. But someone threw a rock through their window, and I asked them, why would this happen? Why would someone do this? And they said, oh, because we're Black. And so I went and talked to my family about, like, how could this be? And I was really upset, not just for my friends, but for anyone, because my parents explained it in the, larger scale of it. And that core feeling of, no, I don't agree with this. This isn't okay with me that anyone would experience this is something that hasn't left me. I've gotten more sophisticated. I studied a lot. I've read a lot. I've listened to a lot. But at the core of it, I'm very impacted. And I would argue that we all have different things that move us the most. Sometimes it's the plight of animals that are being harmed in some way. Sometimes it's the environment, ways that the land is being poisoned. But for a lot of us, there are not a lot of important social causes that I don't care about on some level, that are about the needs of the planet, the animals, the environment being healthy, the people just having good experiences, children being taken care of. All of these things move and touch me. And I like to stay somewhat informed about what's happening in the world. And I think on the larger scale, we're in this moment of enormous transformation. So, what I've been shown, kind of bigger picture, is a lot of old souls are in the game right now of being human because we're in a time of such dynamic change. There's just enormous change that's happening over a very, very, very short period of time, technologically, social conscious wise. I'm not saying there isn't a long way to go, but the amount that the dials moved as far as what we consider important and what we have values about collectively is tremendously different than it would have been for someone 100 years ago. There's enormous amounts of this collective desire of, may we all be well, may the planet be well, may the animals be well, may the plants be well, may the people be well, may the children be well. This desire is very, very alive in the hearts and minds of an enormous amount of the population. And again, the old souls who came here in this really dynamic time are a lot thicker on the ground than I think that perhaps we've been at any other time in history. I don't know, haven't done a definitive survey, but it's sort of a unique, amazing time. So, how do we balance the both and of having jumped into this incarnation experience at this tumultuous time of the vibration changing and all these amazing astrological events and all of this movement from a real humanitarian and collective good perspective of wanting to be in the game, wanting to participate, wanting to be part of it, along with a whole bunch of other souls. But then we go and put on the veils of separation, so we cease to see how our participation is woven in with the whole, and we're in our own lane doing us, incarnate on the planet, dealing with all the complexity of being human. One of the things that's hard for people who have high levels of energetic and emotional sensitivity is that the collective consciousness has been really loud for a couple of years with the whole COVID experience. A lot of people are thinking about the same thing at the same time, which isn't usual. We usually have more diversity, and to have a global pandemic, even back in the day when things moved through the globe, they hit different places at different times, and we didn't have the, turn on Facebook or your local media station and get the latest, statistics. We're all getting waves of information at the same time, which activates our minds. AP press is powerful, but it's also, we're getting waves of information. And there's an interconnectedness. If you were part of the experience of World War II, but you were also on the farm milking the animals, or, dealing with kids and all that kind of thing, you would have had information, but you wouldn't have had these kind of moment by moment updates that really bring things very much into our space. So the question, or the complexity for me, is how do I stay honoring of my deep and profound desire, may all beings be well, but not be debilitated by the suffering of others, so not have my empathy so activated that I'm less effective in my own life. So an example of this, I have unfollowed the people who want to raise awareness of animal cruelty by putting abused animal pictures into their Facebook feed. I'm like, this doesn't change how I care about animals. It doesn't change the action I'm going to take. It just devastates me at a moment that I'm really needing to rest my mind. So I'm scrolling on Facebook. I'm looking for, how are the people I care about doing? What's going on in the world? Connection, amusement, relaxation, and being hit with a graphic image. It's expensive. So I curate that. I take it out of my feed no matter how much I care about the person, if that's something they need to do. So in general, even if I'm not seeing pictures of human suffering in my face all the time, I'm still really aware. I'm aware of, the incredible bureaucratic complexity of humans organizing themselves in ways that they never have before, and what the impact is. And we have so many lenses through which we can see the impact, which can be really powerful, but it can also really leak our energy. So there's a meme that's a joke about, like, my brain is like an internet window with, 27 browser windows open, and I don't know which one is playing the music. And there can be this leaking of energy as we resonate with collective pain, and pain that's not our own, and worry about what's going on with the weather in places that we don't live. And I would argue that leaking your energy with diffuse suffering over the suffering of others isn't a very effective way to participate that's helpful in the world. So I don't want to advocate a stark, Brene Brown calls it Viking or victim mentality, which is like, I'm out for number one and the rest of the world can, I don't care how it affects them. Incidentally, most of us don't enjoy the people who are participating like that. Their outcomes are actually much worse, much higher rates of suicide and addiction, and it's not a psychologically sustainable way to participate in the world. So we all have probably been buffeted in some way by someone who was employing that mindset, who plowed into us in some way without caring, whether it was, driving in unpleasant ways on the freeway, without regard to cutting us off, or, just any form of, I don't care how this affects you, I just want what I want. But that being said, we don't want to swing the pendulum all the way that way, but neither do we want to leak our energy with this diffuse pain over all the different pain points that we can see. And there was a podcast by a woman named Hillary Rushford. She calls it the You're Welcome podcast. And I think the question was, am I loving right? And I don't even think it was the question her audience member was asking, but it sparked this really cool discussion that she had about this notion that we can all love different things and everything is right and good about this. So you may be more moved by racism in the United States, or transgender rights, or the Amazon being deforested, or, rescue dogs, being taken care of, a particular breed of rescue dogs. And if we all tried to show up for everything, then we would just diffuse our energy. We'd have just this teeny tiny fraction. If you imagine trying to donate to charities, you're like, okay, here's your 2 cents and here's your 2 cents. Like, literally that might be what you could contribute. Whereas if you focus your energy onto something, you can be more involved. You can do something. So there's a certain amount of choosing where not to scatter your energy, where to be invested in what you want to offer to the world. And one of the caveats I want to put on this is I work with a lot of people whose journey on this planet ended up being a lot harder than they expected. They naively thought that incarnating with an alcoholic, physically abusive father wouldn't be such a big deal because of their profound soul wisdom. And they may have had ways that they endured that before, but it wasn't necessarily in a nuclear family configuration where you were trapped at home with the dude. Children in other lifetimes had a lot more ability to go hang with the neighbors, and if they were going to be useful and do chores, they could, semi-rehome themselves as they got older. There was a different impact of one individual parent compared to now. So sometimes people miscalculate. And so I want to offer the heal thyself first. If you are bleeding, don't go bind someone else's wounds. It's very tempting to do. The wounded healer is classic, and that can mean a number of different things with that phrase. But there are a lot of therapists that I've worked with where I really felt like they needed a hefty dose of their own medicine. I was like, wow, I can't believe someone who is a professional therapist just said the thing that they said to me that has these kind of blind spots. And so there are lots of people who are very tempted to go and help others who appear on the outside to be struggling more in a more difficult place. It's very, very seductive, the codependency thing where you find under-functioning people and over-function, and then you don't have to look at your stuff. And so there's a discipline in saying, let me make my side of the street clean. Let me tend my own house and my own garden and my own world, and then gift to the rest of the world what's left over. So, this might look like, I have an abundance of vegetables. This is as a literal example and also as a metaphor. You have the vegetables that you need, and then you ideally can gift the ones that aren't useful to you to other people. And there's a filling up your own cup before you give to others. And this can be really hard if you have a really strong service to others, humanitarian spirit. So it's important to be able to really honestly self-assess whether it's a good idea to be working on behalf of others, or whether you maybe want to find the simplest way to earn the money that you need to earn that leaves you the best budget and the most time and energy on your hands to get the healing support that you need. So I want to acknowledge that just because that flame lives inside of you, sometimes it needs adult supervision. My archetype of the healer needs adult supervision, or I would just give and give and give unsustainably to other people. It never gets boring to hold space for others, but if I try to talk more than a certain number of hours a day, it's not good for my voice, and I don't get exercise, and I don't have time or energy to make a nutritious meal or, enjoy being with friends. It's not a good, sustainable, balanced life, especially because, in the modern era, I don't have people who are, taking care of the business side of things for me. I have to run a business as well as a vocation. I'd say have to, but the truth is I want to. I love that. But as a result, the archetype of the healer needs adult supervision, so I get my taxes paid on time, which is less compelling than healing work for others. But beyond that, when you have energy to share, getting clear about where you want to contribute. I think a lot of people are leaking emotional energy all over the place, but not really taking meaningful action. So it's powerful to say, I'm going to put aside 3% of my discretionary money. Like, when money comes in, I'm going to put aside 3% or whatever the amount is, 5%, 10%, some amount so that I can give. I don't have time to volunteer, but I want to give. Or I don't have a lot of extra money, but I could find a few hours a week to volunteer, and I could work with this. There are ways that we can take right action. So I think there are a lot of people who their heart is just shredded by the pain that they see in the world, who aren't getting the balancing reward of taking action. One of the teaching stories they use is the guy seeing all the starfish who've been washed up on the beach and walking down the beach and throwing the starfish back into the ocean so that they'll survive. And somebody's saying, like, Why are you even doing this? It doesn't matter. You can't even come close. You can throw starfish in all day and you'll never, ever, ever, you're not even making a dent. You can't. There are too many of them. And the person's saying, well, it matters to that one and it matters to this one that I just threw. So a certain amount of that feeling where ideally we don't allow our emotional matrix to resonate so much with the pain of others. And some of the Buddhist teachings have some really beautiful maps and ways of thinking about transpersonal compassion, where you can hold softness and compassion, but not leak your personal energy, not have that empathy where you're running the suffering of others through your own personal emotional circuits. I feel like there's a different chamber or functionality of our heart that's meant to hold transpersonal compassion in a way that just is a aliveness expression that we don't really get taught. And so we end up thinking it's supposed to be our personal emotional matrix, and that's not very sustainable. So coming back around to the Byron Katie wisdom, one of the things that you could do for yourself is ask yourself the question, what would it be like if I believed that the world was just fine? It's messy, it's in take apart, we're moving at lightning speed, there's still a lot of work to do, it's more needs met overall in certain areas. In some areas, we should probably put attention on the fact that we can make an environmental mess bigger than our ancestors. Our ancestors made environmental messes, but not on the scale of modern people. One of the things I found very heartening is in the 80s and early 90s, what I was hearing about in high school was the hole in the ozone layer and the deforestation of the Amazon rainforest. And we are still cutting down the Amazon rainforest, which I don't like. I'm all for supporting the Amazon rainforest, but it isn't happening anywhere close to the rapidness or the speed that it was in the 80s, because a lot of people got the idea that chopping down the Amazon rainforest was a bad idea, and we moved away from the products that increase the hole in the ozone layer, and it's not all the way there, but it's gotten smaller, it's improved. So you could say, like, yeah, it doesn't mean we fall asleep at the wheel, it doesn't mean there isn't work to do, but what if we're doing a fantastic job? What if everything's on track? What if the people that from this huge distance away I'm seeing as a victim? A lot of times we look at suffering with a victim, perpetrator, rescuer triangle, and we're the rescuer, but eventually we get tired. But what if the person we're casting as victim is actually super resourceful? A lot of times you zero down and you look at the strategies that people have, and they're actually quite resourceful. They find really good ways to meet the needs of whatever they have or whatever they're up to. And the powerful thing about the Byron Katie work, you start with questioning a statement. So the statement could be things are terrible in the world, or there's way too much suffering. And you go through this process of asking yourself these questions. It's good to write it all down, but the process could lead you to question your thinking in a really authentic way that might lead you to conclude that there's a lot more story of health and resilience and things going really well in the world than there is of doom, destruction, and despair. Granted, if you listen to any kind of news outlet, then, for sure you're going to think things are terrible. They're reporting on all the problems and challenges. Literally, that's what gets our minds to pay attention. So our news stations are woven in with capitalism, and they're powered by advertisers in most cases. And so the effect that they're going for is people tuning in. So telling a story with the most inflammatory headline compels attention, and fear and anger are some of the things that we're hardwired to pay the most attention to, because in a tribal society, you want to pick up those cues really quickly from the people around you. If there's a lion stalking the children, the faster the fear and upset runs through and everyone gets on the same page of trying not to have the children eaten by the lions, the better. So there are good reasons for it, but it's not a very good representation of the world. One of the things that I kind of note, kind of laughing, is the belief in our heads that there are way more serial killers than there are in the world because it's a popular genre of fiction. They're terrible, evil, horrible people in the world, but based on how they populate our books where we're exploring something or driving a storyline, we can be led to believe that there's much more creative and pernicious evil in the world than is factually true per capita. A lot more people are much more nuanced and complicated and merely messy. And for sure, we can think of appalling examples of harm done by an individual, but there's also a lot of other kinds of things. Like I really like the whole superhero genre, but I gave up watching some of the DC universe because it was all so dark. You had to have really terrible, complicated evil and harm. It's just a dark worldview that sets the stage for the most dynamic participation of the hero who is having an interesting journey. And I realized that spending time in that worldview framework extensively, watching the series on Netflix wasn't a best choice for me. One of the things that science can tell us is if you believe you live in a benevolent universe, your outcomes emotionally, psychologically, physical health, longevity are better than if you believe you live in a neutral or hostile world. So whatever is true, there is a psychological benefit which ideally makes you happier and more effective to act. There seems to be this bizarre belief that the way to create change is to create misery and suffering and pain over it. And if people are hurt enough that they'll act. And maybe that's true for some demographics, but people who have really high empathy are needing to learn to manage that and dampen it so that we aren't just sitting around suffering over other people's suffering and not able to do us, not able to show up with our gifts and our dynamic nature. And there's a both and, I think it's important. One of the things that I look at for a healthy person who I'm interested in knowing is whether they have the maturity and the inclination to pay attention to the ripples of their actions on others. So a balanced person who's not under some kind of emotional stress state can walk through the supermarket and just be aware of how they're sharing space with other people. I noticed early on in the pandemic, I joked that even though the masks were only going over our nose and mouth, they messed with our peripheral vision because the complexity of everything that was going on emotionally and this having this piece of cloth on your face seemed to have the result where people who were trying to social distance lost their ability to use their peripheral vision to see whether they were stepping in front of someone when they went to go try to grab their bag of salad. There were a lot more near collisions with people who weren't trying to create that effect. They were just more full with their experience, and so their ability to have that situational awareness of how do I move for my goal, which is to get my groceries, in a way that I'm not cutting other people off and making their journey harder and dishonoring the fact that we're sharing space. And there are lots of ways to do that. It becomes sophisticated in relationships. But that movement through the world, I think, is important and a good thing to pay attention to. It's a complicated thing when you make other people's journeys harder for your messiness, and some people will not be shy about letting you know. You will get feedback if your messiness is making other people's journeys harder, and it won't necessarily be kind or balanced, but there's a lot of friction that gets created when people are messy with each other in that way on whatever level. So there's an invitation. This really does have a homework if you choose to accept it, or it may just be something to mull over. But who would you be in the world if you believed right down to your bones that all is fundamentally well? For sure, there's more work to do, but there are a whole bunch of old souls that are incarnate who are passionately and dynamically engaged. Like there are people who are super passionate about any cause you could care to name. And how do you move through the world? Having a certain amount of awareness. I'm not going to figure out a way to make my life zero waste in the near future. It's too complicated, but surely I will recycle. I feel better about recycling than not. And another piece that you may want to seek out in your social activism is the emotional calibration. So I really like social activists who are like, this is the coolest thing ever. I know a educator peripherally who's educating about systems of racism and how it intersects with capitalism and other systems of power. And the thing is, she's super geeky and lit up about it. She's like, this is so cool. I get to teach this stuff. It's awesome. I love my life. I love getting to do this. And there's this energy that's really magnetic that's resulting in a lot of people paying her money and her making what appears to be, at least from the distance that I know, a very good living because she's joyfully getting to share stuff about something she really cares about. And the notion of social activism that isn't guilting or shaming, but is more about how fun is it to get to move the dial on this? How fun is it to use my time and my talent and my presence to have a particular impact that matters to me? That would be so much more magnetic for people getting involved. If you're like, wow, like Girl Scout cookies, they're really effective. Whatever you think about the Girl Scouts, at the end of the day, they're these adorable, sweet girls who are, doing an organized activity that they care about. So you're ideally supporting children, and then cookies are delicious. And, again, there's complexity because they aren't necessarily optimal for your body in large quantities. But the success of the Girl Scout movement is that you're pairing something where you're getting to do something you feel good about, ideally with something that you get to also have a treat, and it kind of makes it fun and cool. And there's a charity water that I donate to, and it just feels delightful to leverage money to having wells drilled for people who don't have access to clean water. Like, it just makes me really happy to think about a peripheral part of my moving through the world is my being one of the people who throws a little bit of money. I don't have a lot of money on hand at this moment to contribute in huge numbers, but my movement through the world is creating that outcome in this really distant kind of way. And there's a happiness in my heart. And I think part of what's successful about that charity is they really speak to like, hey, look at us doing cool work. My toilet paper company, Who Gives a Crap, has all this like sustainable toilet paper. They make toilet paper out of bamboo, and they donate a bunch of their profits to building toilets in places that don't have them. They want everybody to have really good access to a toilet, and that's their mission. And they're just super fun. They have all these like really cheeky sayings like, hey, mail delivery person, thanks for carrying our toilet paper, and nice bum written on the side of it. And these patterns. It's just there's this joy around something where there's a lot of good in it, and it's still nice toilet paper. I like the deluxe bamboo specifically, but you don't have to have toilet paper that's miserably uncomfortable. So looking at what would bring me the most joy, what do I just really, really have the most compelling nature that I can also move the dial on in a way that is joyful for me. So the Who Gives a Crap toilet paper company, they came up with this entrepreneurial approach to humanitarian work. They didn't start a nonprofit, they started a for-profit that has ecologically sustainable toilet paper, so they make it super easy and super fun. While doing this mission, they didn't go join a nonprofit where they're, amplifying information about the suffering of people who don't have toilets. And neither is right or wrong, but there's this dynamic nature to how you want to use your gifts. So I thought about being an activist. I was very involved with organizations in college, and on one level it was really disillusioning because I saw a lot of the manipulation of how money didn't go where they were saying it went, and things like that, but also realizing that it exhausts me, arguing with people and trying to affect political change is really depleting. And I'm really grateful for all the people who are marching and advocating and lobbying and doing all of those kind of things. I think that's marvelous and really important. But I'm really energetically sensitive, and it would exhaust and deplete me And I don't think that I have a skill set that would make me so good at it that I could do such a better job than anyone else who's in there. So I love funding activists. I totally want them to have the money to go, make a fuss about the things that I feel are really important to raise the issues. And for me, helping people to be really whole and right with themselves and live lives they can thrive in and enjoy their time here. And I really believe that if people have access to all their soul parts, they'll naturally be more compassionate. If they're not depleted and exhausted and constantly in struggle just to get through the day, they'll have energy left over. And it genuinely feels good to share that in ways that there's good in it for other people. So in terms of that, I've curated a life for myself that has enormous clarity about what I want to offer and what I want to provide and what my lane looks like. And I still have to do the work not to leak my energy with over empathy for the suffering of others. And I think it's good to always be in conversation with ourselves. I think it's always good to be asking, how can I help move the dial on all these different things? How could I participate more elegantly? How could I, have a better effect on the world? But we don't want to become depleted to the point that we can't do us. And there's a nuanced balance, and the pendulum swing of complete self-sacrifice or complete selfishness is not optimal, but I don't feel like I meet a lot of people who are at the extremes. It's more like people who end up being kind and doing good in the world, and then constantly having this underlying guilt and sense of not enough, and emotionally taking on the whole problem of the world and carrying it on their own, rather than having a sense of, yeah, I'm part of the collective humanity that, is now concerned with climate change and figuring out ways to move the dial, and I'm part of that collective consciousness, and I have my piece that looks like this. And so what I want to offer is just the idea that leaking your emotional energy suffering over the suffering of others is not something that serves anyone or anything. It just adds more angst into the collective. So at a minimum, let's not do that. If you want to be selfish, and you're just happy in your own lane, I think there's more good in that than you being depleted and depressed and screaming at people on social media, but not actually having the energy to make change. I'd rather have somebody just off doing them being happy. So consider the impact of what you engage with mentally. So that's one piece of it. And consider who you would be if you really believed in your bones and you cultivated and tended the belief, because there's a lot of stuff that's constantly telling us this isn't true. But what if in your bones you really came into relationship with the possibility that everything is in take apart, and it's loud and it's messy and it's complicated, but it's amazing and it's elegant, and that fundamentally humanity is on a good destiny path toward ever increasing degrees of everything in the world being well. And it's in the middle of the story. We're in our part of the hero's journey that has all this layer and complexity. But who would you be if there was nothing wrong and you got to participate in service and contribution to humanity for the pure joy of it? Because there was more joy in being part of this at a level where you used your talents and your gifts and your inclination and your passions in a way that was really aligned, and only from a place of keeping your own cup full. It's a really different model, and I just want to offer that. I think there's a lot that can be worked with and unpacked here, and this is a mentality that would need to be tended. Anyone who's grown a garden where you get really good rain, there's a lot of weeding, there's other stuff that grows in. And so this is definitely a mindset that will need tending and supporting and cultivating if you choose to have it, because it is very out of sync with the mainstream cultural ideas and beliefs that we're absorbing by osmosis. And I would argue that that's a good skill to have. Part of dismantling racism is knowing that we have systemic racism and we absorb it unconsciously. And so what are your processes to unpack that and dismantle that and clean it up when it starts to arise inside of you? Likewise, as a woman in a society with a lot of stuff that's really messed up about the messages we have about gender, my being sane really has a lot of work to do with being able to pull the weeds on the idea that my value is intricately tied to my appearance and my conformity with perceived social value. Science will tell me that doesn't make me happy, but if I don't tend those kind of mindset things, it creates energy leaks and it creates belief systems that are really harmful. And I would argue that there's a merit to constructing your worldview, and it has to work for you. It has to be something that's authentic and true, but the Byron Katie method can give you the opportunity to question whether your truth could be that all is well. All is well, and I'm part of a really dynamic moment in history, doing me to the best of my ability. Thank you so much for joining me. To learn more about me and my work, please visit my website at handsoverheart.com. There you can join my mailing list for access to free bonus content in the members-only area. If you've enjoyed this, please consider subscribing and leaving a review. It would help me out a lot. Also, a special thank you to my patrons for your support. You offer me the time freedom to work on passion projects like this one. If you'd like to receive personal shamanic support from me and my team of guides, please consider joining my Patreon community. You'll find the link below. And again, thank you so much for listening. This is Katie Weatherup, wishing you wholeness and happiness.